Welcome to Zero. I'm Oscar Boyd. Today, a milestone for cleantech. Hello, Akshat.
Hi.
So everyone listening will know that you usually host this podcast, but they might not know that you also regularly write a newsletter for Bloomberg Green. And your most recent newsletter caught my eye. It's all about China's energy exports. China is the leading exporter of clean tech, as something we've discussed a lot of times on Zero. And the US is one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels globally. But you're the first person that I've seen doing a comparison of the actual numbers of these two countries' exports. That was the subject of your newsletter. What did you find?
Yes. So this is a weekly podcast. The newsletter is daily and has a lot more ideas. So I hope people will subscribe. Look, we cover climate tech on this podcast fairly regularly. And we know that China is the biggest producer of climate tech. But what I hadn't seen was a comparison between these two numbers, because we also know that the US under this Donald Trump administration is trying to boost its fossil fuel exports.
Drill, baby, drill.
Not just that, though, because Joe Biden was also helping increase oil and gas exports. So we know that there was an upward trend in US oil and gas exports. But do they compare? And actually, they do. I was kind of surprised. So what I did was I picked data that spoke to the strategic goals that the two administrations were laying out. Donald Trump was saying, we would like our allies, or sometimes force them to buy our fossil fuels. And China was saying, look, we have all this clean tech. They'll never say overcapacity, but we have more production than we can consume. We would like to export it to you. Who is buying what? And China wins out. Like, there's a clear winner, which surprised me.
And this is where we get into the narrative of petrostate versus electrostate. Do you just want to define what we mean by those two terms?
Yeah, these terms are becoming more used, which is fun, but definitions are important. A classic petrostate definition is a country that depends for a majority or like a heavy percentage of their gross domestic product on fossil fuels. So 30% or so, you would typically think of a Middle Eastern country as a petrostate. But petrostates also have a certain characteristic. They behave in a way that they would like more people to buy their fossil fuels. So the US doesn't fall in the category of having a very large percentage of its GDP dependent on fossil fuels, but it does fall in the category of wanting other countries to buy fossil fuels. So the US is being now more commonly called a petrostate. Electrostate is a new term. It's the term that says that that country doesn't want to depend on petroleum, typically oil and gas, but on electricity. That electricity may come from all sorts of sources, may come from coal. But because electricity is a form of energy that can be converted more efficiently into other things, that country is making the bet that electricity is what's going to power their economic growth. And perhaps the electricity industries will become the export driver for that country. And China is referred to as an electrostate. You could also think of Iceland or Norway, which are heavily electric in their energy consumption, total energy consumption, as electrostates, though they don't export that much.
So you said you found a clear winner between the two. You said it was China. Give me the numbers.
So the numbers really did surprise me. If you look at 2025 data as of July, because that's the latest data that we could find, China had exported about $120 billion worth of clean tech exports. And in that, I'm counting batteries, electric cars, solar panels, even electrical devices like transformers, wind turbines. And US fossil fuel exports, just oil and gas, because we can measure that pretty clearly, was about $80 billion until July. And actually, China hit a record in August in its clean tech exports, almost $20 billion.
So China exported in the first half of this year alone $40 billion more in green tech than the US did in fossil fuels. And you have a great graph in your newsletter showing this. We'll put a link in the description for anyone who wants to see it, wants to read it. Is this a new trend?
Well, I thought it was new, but even 2024, China just eked out ahead of the US in this comparison. So China sold about $180 billion worth of clean tech last year, whereas all of US oil and gas exports came up to $150 billion. And worth noting, oil was at a much higher price in 2024 than it is this year.
Is this difference between the US and China, is it going to stay? Or are we going to see kind of the US now go turbo mode and try and increase its fossil fuels exports even further?
So this remains to be seen. There are different ways to count the numbers that I have done. You could include upstream, midstream, oil products. You could also include fossil fuel car exports, which the US does export in quite a few numbers, like many millions of cars. And that way you could see that the US ekes out ahead of China. It could also, with this drill baby drill mantra, just increase a lot more of its oil and gas exports. There's a limit because ramping that up, requires private industry to do it. Whereas in China, sometimes you can get the government to decide that, yes, we need to export more and private industry follows. In the US, you'll have to coax them to do it. And we have seen that the oil and gas industry doesn't always play ball with the administration. It does need to make money. And so if the price of oil is too low, we might not see that much rise in oil exports from the US. But clearly, there is a goal from the administration to try and become a bigger fossil fuel exporter.
And you noted earlier that the US is trying to make its allies purchase its fossil fuels. Who's buying China's green tech?
Yes. So fossil fuels are consumed widely, and that means a lot of people buy those fossil fuels. But for the US, European Union is the biggest client for especially liquefied natural gas, but it's trying to sell it even to China. Whereas for China, the customer base is also pretty vast because developing countries are quite interested in clean tech these days. We've talked about how Pakistan imported something like 25% of their entire power grid's capacity in solar panels in 1 year in 2024.
And they're doing something similar with batteries this year, right?
That's right. And this kind of story gets repeated in different countries around the world. So the other chart that I was pretty pleased to see in the story was this chart of electric car exports to different parts of the world coming from China and how they start small and they all supercharge soon. So ASEAN, about $1 billion worth of Chinese electric cars. LATAM, another $1 billion. Middle East, $500 million. Africa, $200 million last year, but from really almost zero a couple of years back.
So we see from this data that China's exporting this massive amount of clean tech around the world, but actually primarily it's using a lot of it at home. So most of the solar that it produces is installed in China. Most of the wind turbines that it produces are installed in China. And last week we saw another report from Ember which made headlines, and this was talking about the amount of electricity produced globally by renewables. What did that report say?
So we have had a few times a day or a month when the total amount of electricity made from renewables, which is solar, wind, and hydro, exceeded that from coal. Coal, for a very long time, has been the largest source of fuel for electricity production. But Ember's report says this first half of the year, so for 6 months, the renewables production exceeded coal. And if that continues for the second half of the year, which it might, then this becomes the first year when renewables will have produced more electricity than coal. And it's what they call a secular trend. This is likely to continue because renewables are getting cheaper, are getting deployed much faster, even as we do know that India and China and a few other countries are building coal power plants.
And this is really good news because obviously the other thing about coal is it is the dirtiest fuel.
Yeah, of course. So coal, for every unit of electricity, produces, say, X amount of emissions. Gas produces half that. And renewables produce almost none of the carbon emissions, even after accounting for all the carbon emissions that go into production of renewables. So that is a very good story. Some of it is, of course, gas swapping out coal. And that doesn't mean it's going all clean, but it is going slightly cleaner. And that story is something we covered on the pod recently when we talked about the gas turbine shortage.
And there was another really interesting stat in that report, and that was saying that growth in solar and wind generation outpaced the rise in global electricity demand. Why is that important?
One way in which people have talked about the energy transition is to go from fossil fuels to clean energy. But if you look at the numbers, it really has been energy addition for most of it, because it's not like the world is swapping out fossil fuels and using renewables. Instead, it was just using all of it a little more. Mm-hmm. So now that renewables are growing faster than electricity consumption growth overall means renewables are starting to replace fossil fuels in the entire global mix. Obviously, it happens in rich countries. The UK now has 75% of its electricity coming from renewables. Coal got shut in 2024. So replacement has been happening in many countries. But at a global level, it was an addition story. Now, it might become a substitution story finally.
So previously, countries, as they were developing, their electricity demand was growing and solar was basically filling in that gap, or renewables were basically filling in that gap.
And some fossil fuels too.
And some fossil fuels. But now this report is saying renewables are eating the lunch of fossil fuels.
Starting to. Maybe nibbles.
Maybe little nibbles. Well, Akshat, thank you very much for joining me on this special bonus episode of Zero.
This was a good fun chat.
We'll put links to Akshat's newsletter and the Ember report in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back later this week with a regular episode of Zero.